from Salem, Ohio. And I live here with my husband. He is a union laborer, construction worker, and we're here with our children. And I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now with you, if that's all right. All right, can you see my slides now? Yes, okay. Can you still hear me? Okay. So we live here in Salem with our family. There's my daughter, Ellie, and she will be a senior this year at Salem High School. There's our son, John, who just graduated from Salem High School, and he's going to be attending the University of Akron this fall. But I'm really here today to talk to you about my son, Mac, and that's his picture there. And Mac had just graduated from high school in 2020. When he was 18 in July of 2020, just after he graduated, he died by suicide. Oh no, my screen, there we go. There, that's Mac, that's his senior picture. So really what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit more about Mac before, because Mac was, he was sort of your typical kid, but I think he was a great kid. He was not, no one thought that he would ever die by suicide. In July of 2020, he had just graduated from high school. He had his career pretty much squared away. He was a firefighter. He was on a volunteer department with Green Township, and they were sending him to school. He was going to be a full-time firefighter. He'd finished fire training 1. He was enrolled in EMT training. He was pretty much set in his career. He loved to play the guitar. He played in a jazz band at school. He played in the praise band at church. He would play up in his room. He just liked to play guitar. He was really active in 4-H. He was their vice president. He showed cattle. He was, along with being a firefighter, which he did on a volunteer basis, but he had finished fire training, was going to school for that. He was also working full-time as a landscaper. Another boy on the fire department had a landscaping company, and so they would, he worked for him, and it was perfect setup because if the tones went off, they could both stop and run calls. He was running about 90% of their calls at that point. He had a ton of friends his age, but also, you know, a lot of adult relationships through work and school and church. Just, he was lovable. People loved Mac. He had a girlfriend, but they had just broken up. In June, after the lockdown ended, she kind of ended things. She was going away to college in Maine in the fall, and she didn't want a long-term relationship. And so she kind of ended things so that they could get used to it before she went off to college. And that was devastating to him for a while, but he was doing okay. He was dating a little bit. He'd been out on 1 or 2 dates, and he seemed like he was managing. Toward the end of June, we had just taken really our first extended family vacation, and it was wonderful. We had a great time. The girlfriend was supposed to go with us, and of course, obviously she didn't. So that made him sad, but we still had a good time. We were at the beach, and we had been home from vacation for about a week. When July 12th hit. So Sunday, July 12th was sort of just a normal day, as normal as it could be in the middle of the pandemic. So we had just come out of lockdown. I'd been to drive-in church because that was the only kind there was. Mac had spent the night at a buddy's house. They camped out in a tent, and he got home about, I want to say noon, maybe, on that Sunday. He went out to lunch with a friend. I was actually kind of excited because it was a girl, and I thought maybe he was dating again, someone else. He said they were just friends. It was a sort of a lazy July Sunday. So he'd gone out to lunch. In the evening, it was probably about 7:30. He was home from lunch. My son, John, was playing Fortnite on the computer. My daughter was away at youth group. I was watching Netflix, and Mac was just up in his room, relaxing, had the air conditioning on. It was his one day off. He worked 6 days a week. He had one full-time job and a part-time job. And it was just kind of relaxing. About 7:45 that evening, he came downstairs. Oh, my husband was away at a trustees meeting. Matt came down the stairs and said that he was going to go for a run, which was a little unusual. But he did. I left to go get my daughter. I came back home. I asked John if he was back, and he said, I think so. But I didn't really hear from him. And it was about 8:45. And I went upstairs to check on him. And I knocked at his door, and he didn't answer. And I turned the door and opened it. And Mac had hung himself from his loft bed. It was about 5 feet off the ground. So he was just kneeling there. And I remember thinking that he should just stand up, and I ran over and grabbed him, and but he didn't. He didn't stand up. In fact, he never regained consciousness after that. I cut him down. We started CPR. My son called 911. First responders came, and he never really regained consciousness. They got a heartbeat. They took him to our local hospital here in Salem, and they vented him and got him ready to be life flighted to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. The thing that was kind of, I guess, significant, my son, my middle son, called his football coach on the way there. And when we got to the hospital, my son's fire chief, Mac's fire chief, was there at the hospital with us. But then they life flighted him to St. E's, and we were sort of on our own then. So we had to drive to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and there were a series of miscommunications. We couldn't get in the doors. They were locked, whatever. And he was there for about another 12 hours. No, 18 hours. It wasn't until Monday around 2:30 that we were finally able to get a neurologist to come in, and he performed a sort of a 10-point test. And eventually, at the end of the last test, they said negative, time of death 2:20. And so he really didn't look any different. That was the hard part, you know. He was on a ventilator, and I asked if they could just turn everything off and let us sit there with him. And they couldn't, because he was an organ donor, which is wonderful, and I'm very proud of that. But it was a little unnerving. He looked exactly the way he had for the last 18 hours, except that now he was officially dead. So, yeah. I will talk a little bit more next week about like how we've managed to live since then. But today I just kind of want to talk about in hindsight, you know, it seems like I started this off by saying that nobody would have expected this. At my school, they teach us to look for resiliency boxes for our kiddos. You know, the more checks that they have in those resiliency boxes, the better off they are. And it seemed like Mac checked all the boxes, you know. There was no drug or alcohol addiction. Our family's intact. He has a church family. He had a goal and success in life. He had a career. He had adult support. But in hindsight, there were some things. First of all, I'm sorry, my dog is barking. Please ignore her. First of all, he was a 2020 high school senior. So no prom, no graduation, you know, no senior year of baseball. He missed so many of those things that he was looking forward to. He did have a history of concussion and depression. He suffered a really bad concussion when he was about 15 years old. A couple of years before, he had some depression issues. We got him seen by a doctor who referred him to a facility that he was seeing a counselor and a psychiatrist. He was medicated briefly, but we were told that, you know, he was okay. They weaned him off of the medicine and he was only seeing his counselor as necessary. He is a firefighter, and he was a young firefighter at 18. He'd seen a lot of things. Just in the few weeks before he died, there were a couple of really bad accidents with young people. And I talked to him about, you know, let's talk about that. But he was very conscious of HIPAA laws, and he was very wanting to do the right thing. And he said he just couldn't really talk to me about it. And I suggested that he talk to his counselor, but it was 2020 and he couldn't get in to see him. They were, you know, they weren't seeing patients, and then it was only telehealth and he wasn't interested in that. We do have a bit of a family history of suicide. Mac's uncle, my brother, died by suicide when Mac was about 8 years old. So, but even so, I was blindsided. Like, I had no clue. I couldn't believe that this had happened. That day, there were no real indicators other than he wanted to run. So this, believe it or not, I was actually very brief. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them next week. But I'm just hoping that this might help somebody in some small way, maybe not be blindsided. So that's my story. And if you have any questions, I hope you'll ask me next week.